Climate Change Committee was formed by the Climate Change Act in 2008, and the Climate Change Act is the legislation that requires the UK government to develop policies to hit a carbon budget, which will end in the year 2050 at that target. Initially in 2008, that legislation required an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050. And then in 2019, that legislation was updated to net zero, which is effectively 100% CO2 emissions reduction over 1990 levels. And so the reason that legislation creates the Climate Change Committee is that MPs from all parties decided that it was not within their competences to decide how much CO2 emissions should be reduced each year. So what the CCC does is it's seemingly, or it's called an independent organization, which just means it's independent from government. Doesn't mean it's independent from the climate change agenda, and it certainly doesn't mean that the population, the members of the Climate Change Committee are open-minded about it at all. In fact, the CCC has been populated by, to put it kindly, ideological zealots about emissions reduction and the green agenda. So they're very determined people, perhaps more ambitious than Parliament itself. And I think that's part of the key to understanding climate politics and climate and energy policy, is that these people have been extremely driven to press further than what democratically elected representatives are really capable of achieving. So if we got policies that sort of inflicted on us as much as the green blob, as we've come to call them, really want, then there would probably be something not much short of a civil war or a revolution, because what they really intend to do is really quite just transform society in really quite fundamental and radical ways. So the way the CCC is sort of set up is that it designs 5 yearly budgets for targets. So how we get to 100% CO2 emissions reduction by 2050 is in 5-year stages. Each one's called a carbon budget. We're currently in the fourth budget, and the fifth budget is starts in 2028. And so the work that the CCC has just done now relates to, I think, the years 2038 to 2042. So they're deciding what the framework for energy and climate policy should be in 15 years' time out to 20 years' time, which is really quite ridiculous when you think about it, that, if you could imagine people trying to set policies for today back in 2010, they wouldn't have been able to anticipate COVID. They wouldn't have been able to anticipate the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, just to name just two, and all the other stuff that's happened. So the idea that experts of any kind have this kind of foresight or these kind of crystal balls is absurd. So what the CCC is saying is likely for the year 2040 is that half of all homes will have heat pumps, for example. So it's sort of saying there must be policy. It's saying to Parliament, you must put in place policies that will make half of all homes have heat pumps. And there's, of course, the sort of the very, very few levers available to policymakers or policy analysts of any kind. So what we're going to see is a multiplication of the number of wind farms there are on and offshore, and the number of solar panels and solar farms there are. I think there's a plan in the budget. There's 88 gigawatts of solar power capacity, which is just a huge amount, a huge area of the landscape will be covered in solar panels. And maybe there's an argument that there is the room for it, but there are other effects of that. One of which is to sort of remove agricultural production, and all, of course, all of this requires immense amount of subsidies in order to sort of sustain the economics of wind energy and solar energy, which are at their basics very rational. I think Gordon Hughes this week has also published a criticism of that agenda, pointing out that, well, not just that agenda, of the government's 2030 clean power target. By that time, it looks likely, according to Professor Hughes' analysis, that energy bills will have gone up by another £900. And the government is just refusing to listen to that criticism or that analysis. And of course, it's sort of heavily dependent, the CCC's analysis, on what I call unicorns. So this is stuff like hydrogen. So there's imagining hydrogen is going to replace the role of natural gas and petrol and diesel in certain applications, maybe transport, probably heating, and sort of industrial processes. And CCS is the capture of emissions from gas plants or any industrial process, and then you compress it and cool it, and you bury it in a cave, preferably under the sea. But both of these processes, both hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, are incredibly expensive. Then there's not going to be very much opportunity for cost reductions. But that's how essentially the CCC is sort of making the case for all of its sort of proposals, including heat pumps and wind farms and solar panels. They assume that there's going to be what's called a learning rate, and society is going to be able to get better at producing this stuff for lower cost, which is just a lie. An experience that we've had 25 years of sort of green energy policy, and those policies have only increased costs in that era. Energy prices in real terms have tripled. Okay, so taking that part, the past is prologue. And so we can only really expect energy prices to rise. And unfortunately, the design of the Climate Change Act is such that it's not possible to hold government to account or quangos to account for false promises. Only the emissions reduction targets are enforceable by law. None of the promises of green jobs, green growth, green industrial revolution, and lower bills that politicians and wonks and activists always make, none of those are enforceable. So they're worthless claims. They're empty promises. They won't get delivered because the technology isn't capable of doing what's required. And we're going to be stuck with some very expensive energy in the future, thanks to the likes of the CCC.
Yeah, very interesting and worth pointing out, if people weren't aware, if we wanted net zero to end, it would be necessary either to repeal the Climate Change Act or amend it in some way, correct?
That's right. I think repeal is probably going to be easier for a government in crisis than to amend it. The statutory, there's provision in the Climate Change Act for amending the targets, or either in terms of the year by which they're met or the percentage decrease over 1990 levels. So it allows the Secretary of State to make that amendment, but he can only do it on the condition that he's first sought the advice of the Climate Change Committee, and second, that it's had approval in both houses of Parliament. So if you remember from 2019, when net zero was turned into the target, when the target was turned into net zero from 80%, MPs just took 90 minutes to have that conversation about the next 50 years, well, at that time, 30 something years of energy policy. So it was very easy for politicians to sort of raise the target. It's going to be much more difficult for MPs to reduce it, because there's always going to be a very strong contingent of MPs in Parliament who are completely incapable or unwilling to listen to the complaints of their constituents about rising energy prices, and who are completely vulnerable to the lobbying that's been applied to them by green organizations, green blob organizations. So you'd sooner get ministers of state spitting at you than sort of take on the criticisms of the green agenda. I mean, it's verboten in Westminster pretty much, to give any thought to the criticisms of net zero skeptics. So the culture within Westminster is really not to take any criticism of its essentially what's become the state religion. No one's going to take that criticism seriously, and the CCC isn't going to lower itself to debate about those targets. So I think what's more likely to happen is we're going to have at some point a radical change of government, either that or a very a crisis caused by irrational energy policy will be overcome. Won't be the government won't have any other means to overcome it than to repeal this with the support of Parliament. I think it'll become so obvious that it needs to be repealed that Parliament will sort of be forced into that position. But until then, there's a lot. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And every time it gets worse, I mean, we've just had three. The Ofgem energy price cap has just risen 3 quarters in a row. And at every turn, it's risen 18% since the Labour government came to power. And at every turn, Ed Miliband's response to these people saying this has been say, "We'll have lower bills. We'll have lower bills. We'll have lower bills." But energy prices have gone up a fifth, and that's still his choice of argument. He's completely deaf to the criticism. Luckily, gas prices have just fallen on these global markets that Miliband likes to blame for price rises quite substantially. So it looks like the next quarter we may hopefully have some kind of respite, as it were, from this crisis. But it'll go up again thereafter because they want to increase the number of wind turbines there are, and number of solar panels there are, and so on.
And what needs to happen to move things in the right direction, Ben? Or is it it almost sounds you're saying, yeah, we may just have to wait for the train wreck. I mean, is there a way we can influence it more than that? I mean,
Yeah,
what's possible?
yeah, I don't want to be gloomy. I don't want to be too gloomy about it because the point of Together is to work together to try and change this stuff. So I'm talking. I'm being pessimistic about it in very, very sort of strict, conventionally political terms, right? We can organize people to write letters, and people. There's a lot of inertia about writing letters and other forms of participating in democracy as well, going on protests and sort of making noise in generally, or even organizing their own political representation locally or at national levels. But that's what we have to do, and it's very important to understand how sensitive the democratic system might be to democratic choice. I mean, I think there was a by-election yesterday. It was only a local election. There was only a 16% turnout, which is a travesty. So there's 84% of people didn't vote in that constituency. I think it was Hounslow, part of Hounslow in Greater London, and so you could quite that's an opportunity there for a genuinely democratic movement to sort of mobilize the 84% into voting for something more democratically representative, more progressive, more capable of responding to people's needs. And that could happen very quickly if people were motivated. A lot of the green blob's sort of own internal machinations, their own thinkings, has dwelled on the fact and sort of concerned about the fact that MPs themselves, when surveyed, report that they get very little contact from the public about climate change. It's a very small, very narrow, but very noisy and very well-resourced strata of society that's been sort of able to sort of persuade MPs that this is what the public wants, right? So when people sort of turn their noses up at writing to MPs or signing petitions, I'm like pulling my hair out because MPs tell me, who other politicians who are skeptical themselves, they say what most motivates MPs to sort of reconsider their positions are letters from the public. That's all that remains of the connection between Westminster and the public is letters. It's not as if MPs really participate in local democracy. Many people don't even know who their MPs are, right? So this can be changed through conventional politics, and it can be changed by having more public participation in democratic processes. So and that if that starts to really register with the government and with the Labour Party, and I think it probably is beginning to. Maybe we'll come on to that. Then they'll start to understand that it is a liability, and it's not a liability that they can sort of just overcome with more sloganeering, green jobs, green industrial revolution, green growth, blah 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 blah, or calling or slandering critics, which is something we at Together, of course, have become very used to, having been called Nazis by the likes of Sadiq Khan and the BBC. We just have to show that we're not prepared to tolerate that, and we're not going to back down in the face of that kind of intransigence and abuse.
And you have a film project, I think,
Yes.
coming up. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the film project, and then very much along these lines, what I really want to do is tell the story of net zero. It's and sort of one of the things I think we Together and other groups need to do is really spell it out, really make it quite simple, so that when people are hit with these rising bills and they need explanations as to what that is, it's not just the sort of green blob and stenographers in the mainstream media who are going to try and explain this as Moscow's manipulation of energy markets or whatever excuse Ed Miliband wants to pull out of his hat, or even worse places. So what the film is actually about Ed Miliband, and it's called Miliband and the Design for Britain's Ruin. So and it takes part of 4 parts. And the first one, we're going to really explain why net zero doesn't work, why the solar farms and wind farms and the battery storage units and so on and so forth are essentially at odds with physical reality. And so the second part of the film is going to explain why, in order to overcome that physical contradiction with reality, politicians have had to create they've had to distort energy economics to make green investments viable for people with for the money, basically. But that has failed as well. So there's a failure of the physical reality, is it, if you like. There's a failure to understand the economic reality, and this is essentially this has sort of created the need to change politics. So we have this kind of institutionalized intransigence towards democratic expression, debates, and criticism of green policies. And then so the final part of the film is going to take a look at those three failures. The failure of net zero technology, the failure of net zero economics, and the failure of net zero politics, and sort of ask, well, what's next? Where does this go if government is going to continue to attach itself to this agenda, regardless of any signals from reality that it's failing? How bad can it get, and what are our opportunities for intervening to solve it? So it's quite an ambitious film, but we've got some really good people to be in it, and I hope we can take it bit by bit by bit, and really sort of help shift the public debate and improve the sort of broader understanding, both of the public and in the media, news media sphere. Really start to put some lines down.
Excellent. And where can people find out more about this if they'd like to support it, Ben? Where can they find you online? Where are the best places to go?
Yep, I've got it's a pinned tweet. I'm at Climate Resistance, CLIM8 Resistance on Twitter, if Twitter is your thing. I appreciate it's not for everyone. There's a description of the film at the Daily Skeptic, which is dailyskeptic.org/Miliband. Remember, that's 1L. And there's also I've put a page on it under the media section on my website at climatedebate.co.uk, and also on my Substack, netzeroscandal.substack.com.